Guten Abend, ihr alle. Ich freue mich total, dass ihr alle gekommen seid und wir heute gemeinsam die Premiere dieses wunderbaren Buches feiern können. Ich bin nicht von Sam Zamrik. Und ich finde es besonders schön, dass es hier im Roten Salon passiert, denn ich weiß, dass Sam Zamrik vor ungefähr 2 Jahren hier zum allerersten Mal in Berlin ein Gedicht von sich vorgetragen hat. Insofern finde ich das sehr stimmig. Und wir sind heute hier in Kooperation mit dem Festival Archäologie des Verlustes, kuratiert von Marin Wurster und Petra Kappler. Und ich bedanke mich sehr für die schöne Zusammenarbeit, die das hier heute Abend möglich macht. Ganz im Gegensatz zu dem Verlust, was uns als Thema des Abends sicher auch ein bisschen begleiten wird, will ich erstmal von einem großen Fund sprechen. Denn dieses Buch, dieser Band ist wirklich ein Fund. Sam Zamrik, du bist eigentlich der Fund. Und diesen Fund hätten wir aber nie gemacht, wenn nicht Annika Reich mit ihrer tollen Institution Weiterschreiben und die Elisabeth Ruge Agentur uns diese Lyrik zugänglich gemacht hätte und empfohlen hätte. Sam Zamrik, ich bin wirklich ganz glücklich, dass du dich von uns hast finden lassen und uns dein Vertrauen geschenkt hast. Als du damals in Damaskus geboren wurdest und aufgewachsen bist, hätte wohl niemand vermutet, oder wäre es wirklich alles andere als wahrscheinlich gewesen, dass du 25 Jahre später hier im fernen Berlin einen fulminanten Lyrikband herausbringst auf Deutsch und auf englischer Sprache und für diesen Band sofort einen großen Preis gewinnst. Gestern Abend ist Sam Zamriks Band hier mit dem Wunderblock Award ausgezeichnet worden von der Wunderblock Foundation um Katharina Große. Und Katharina Große sagte gestern, wie sie auf Sam sozusagen gekommen ist. Und sie sagt, sie war bei einer Lesung und hat diese Gedichte gehört und es hat sie so berührt, die Kraft, die aus diesem Text spricht, dass sie sofort wusste, dass dies ihr erster Preiszögling sein wird. Und das kann ich natürlich so gut nachvollziehen, denn wir alle im Verlag, die dieses Manuskript gelesen haben, haben uns irgendwie sofort aufrecht hingesetzt, weil wir wussten, das ist was ganz Besonderes. Es spricht eine solche Kraft eben aus diesen Gedichten und nicht so eine Kraft, die in irgendeiner Art so kraftmeiernd oder protzend ist, sondern man spürt ganz deutlich, natürlich im Verlauf der Lektüre, die so viel von diesem Ich erzählt, dass dieses eine Kraft ist, die sozusagen trotzdem da ist. Da ist ein Mensch, der schreibt, der durch Höllen geschritten ist, das ist ganz klar, der eigentlich alles verloren hat, seine Heimat, eigentlich auch vielleicht seine Sprache verlieren hätte können, dem seine Identität abgesprochen wird, der nicht gesehen wird in diesem neuen Land, der überhaupt kein Mensch mehr ist und der aber sich nicht beirren lässt, sondern an der Sprache, die er selber in ihm ist, sozusagen diese Sprache zu seiner großen Stärke, zu einer Art Waffe auch macht und zu dem, was ihn eigentlich in seinem Wesen ausmacht und so sozusagen ganz laut sagt, hier bin ich. Und das macht diese Gedichte, glaube ich, aus, dass sie sofort unmittelbar zu einem sprechen und einen unglaublich bewegen. Ich will jetzt gar nicht mich in die Tiefen dieser Lyrik hinein begeben. Das wird nachher im Gespräch noch auf ganz andere Weise passieren. Aber ich wollte noch sagen, dass man auch in der Zusammenarbeit, die wir an diesem Text, Sam und ich hatten, doch gespürt hat, was für ein unglaublich belesener, kluger, philosophisch denkender Kopf er ist und mit welcher großen Musikalität er an Sprache rangeht. Und zwar an die englische und die deutsche, die er beide nicht in Wirklichkeit nicht seine Muttersprachen, sondern seine Poesiesprachen sozusagen sind oder die Sprachen, in denen er überhaupt sich künstlerisch ausdrückt. Und natürlich kommt das auch daher, dass er auch Musiker ist. Also er ist ja ein großer Heavy Metaler und ist immer noch Manager einer Band. Und das spürt man diesen Gedichten. Ich kenne mich mit Heavy Metal überhaupt nicht aus, aber dass er sehr musikalisch ist, das kann ich auf jeden Fall bestätigen. Ich freue mich auch, oder ganz besonders, dass wir als Moderatorin Daniela Seel heute erleben werden. Sie ist wie Sam Zamrik Lyrikerin, deren Werk vielfach preisgekrönt ist. Und vor allem aber ist sie die Frau, ohne die Lyrik in Deutschland, die ganze lyrische Landschaft in Deutschland eigentlich überhaupt nicht denkbar ist. In den letzten 20 Jahren hat sie mit ihrem im Übrigen auch preisgekrönten Cookbooks Verlag so viel für die Lyrik geleistet wie eigentlich niemand sonst. Und so, ich würde sagen, den interessantesten AutorInnen eigentlich eine literarische Heimat gegeben. Also ich freue mich wirklich sehr, dass sie heute die Moderation übernimmt und ja, ich wünsche Ihnen allen einen wunderbaren Abend. Nachher können Sie dieses Buch auch käuflich erwerben und dort, also dort ist der Büchertisch und Sam Zamrik wird Sie natürlich auch gerne signieren. Viel Vergnügen.
Thank you, Julia, for the wonderful introduction. It's very humbling. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm very happy to be back in the Volksbühne, where, as Julia has said, I had my very first public reading in cooperation with Bard College Berlin, my first university. Thank you so much for making it. To the people who are watching the stream, also, thank you for tuning in. I will save you a very long speech, and I will begin with the way I like to begin all of my readings, with a poem called Patchwork, which is the easiest way that I can introduce you to myself. Patchwork. My name is the name. My roots are purple. My fertile middlemost shakes my wreath heavy with yellowing myrtle, then oozes with myrrh. Icy glass in my eyes. The irides and whites each hide hosts of wilted narcissi. My head is the sun. My hair is a lion's mane. Its fell rays fix my gaze fore and downwards. My neck is the stump of a pining evergreen. I have a hunch in my back. My arms are blighted, fruitless boughs. I wrench my two quaking knees. Though my indices bend opposite one another and point nowhere, these hands are my tools. First as fists, fingers, then palms, urge, pens, and scale. I stand on 10 toes sewn into steel, 4 soles and heels cast after broken cobblestones. On my 1000th day, I wet the bed. The mother of all monsters was mine, and I missed a half of one brother she'd smothered away. I have white walls, windowsills, and white curtains, a brown table and a silver couch broken with sloth. I reek of late coffee and crushed thyme. I sweat urea and tar and scent myself with neglect. Weave me. And the German translation, the wonderful German translation by Monika Renk. Stückwerk. Mein Name ist der Name. Violett sind meine Wurzeln. Meine fruchtbare, mittigste Mitte schüttelt meinen Kranz, gewichtig vergilbende Myrte. Dann trieft sie vor Myrrhe. eisiges Glas in meinen Augen. Die Iriden und Weißen verstecken ihr Maßen verwelkte Narzissen. Mein Kopf ist die Sonne, eine Löwenmähne mein Haar. Ihr wildes Strahlen hält meinen Blick nach vorne und nach unten. Mein Hals ist der Stumpf eines bedürftigen Immergrüns. Ich trage einen Buckel in dem Rücken. Meine Arme sind vernichtete, fruchtlose Äste. Ich verrenke meine beiden bebenden Knie. Obwohl meine Zeigefinger sich voneinander wegbiegen und nirgendwohin weisen, sind diese Hände mir Werkzeug. Erst als Fäuste, Finger, dann Handflächen, Drang, Stifte und Waage. Ich stehe auf 10 Zehen, in Stahl genäht. 4 Sohlen und Fersen, Abgüsse, zerbrochene Pflastersteine. An meinem 1000. Tag nähste ich das Bett. Die Mutter aller Monster war meine. Und von einem Bruder fehlt mir jene Hälfte, die sie erstickte. Ich habe weiße Wände, Fensterbretter und weiße Vorhänge, einen braunen Tisch und eine silberne Couch, von Faulheit ruiniert. Ich stinke nach spätem Kaffee und zerstoßenem Thymian. Ich schwitze Harnstoff und Teer und parfümiere mich mit Vernachlässigung. Windet mich zum Kranz. Thank you, Daniela, for being here.
Do you want to read some more first?
One more, and then we can start.
Okay.
This next poem is a German original. Will be followed by an English translation by me. Findling. Das große Kind mit langen Beinen und einer unzureichend breiten Brust. Das mit den gebogenen Armen der Armen. Seine Haut hat keine bestimmte Rasse. Farblosigkeit färbt es in allen Farben. Foundling. The large child with long legs and an insufficiently wide chest. There, the one with the arms bent with poverty. Their skin has no race. Colorlessness colors them in all colors.
Yeah. Thank you for your poems and congratulations to your first book. This is quite something.
Thank you. It's very hard to believe, but it's happening.
Yeah. So it was quite obvious just in the first few poems you read. One you wrote in English, one you wrote in German, and then with a translation. So what is language to you? So in one of the poems you write that you have no mother tongue, or the lyrical I, not you, so we will discuss the differences later. But first about language. You already in Damascus you started an English poetry club for writing poetry in English, and now that you are in Germany, you also started writing in German. So what are these languages to you, and what about the Arabic Is it a language for poetry too, for you, or why not?
English has been with me for a very long time. I taught it to myself when I was maybe 6 years old, and it was a way to maybe rebel against my surroundings being so bad. And when I grew up and things became a little more serious, it was also a way to hide and to save myself the troubles of being understood. Then being understood at certain times was actually counterproductive because it could have put your life in danger at some points, but at the same time, I think it was a two-sided equation, I think, because on the one side, working in music and trying to relate to a larger community of metal music, English was a bit of a vessel to kind of reach the largest audience possible, and that still carries through. But it was also a way to kind of, let's say, cipher my words and kind of speaking codes. And it was always that the better or the quicker that you could speak, the less understandable you would be, and therefore the safer you would be. And in that regard, English has been with me all of my life. It has naturally changed coming here, but it still holds that kind of aspect of rebellion. As for German, I learned it due to an urgency. I had to learn it in a sense. Being an outsider and continuing to feel like an outsider, I thought that, since so much emphasis is put on the language, then perhaps that could be the gateway into some kind of belonging. But it ended up actually being just a way to more clearly address the German-speaking people about things that they perhaps cannot see when they find someone either so willing to kind of go along with everything, or someone who is actually taking their space away and trying to preserve their own culture and their own specificities, so to speak. As for Arabic, I grew up in a very isolated home, so I didn't have access to the same kind of media, books, translators, and literature that my peers had and everyone else around me had. So I didn't develop the same kind of tie to classical Arabic as others would in a manner that enabled me to later write in it. And I think that put me at odds with a lot of my peers because, in a sense, we kind of stopped being able to relate to each other unless we reference this outsider language, and it is an outsider language, English. And growing up poor, I also could only speak my own dialect. I never did well in the Arabic classes, so to speak. And there is no literature written in dialect except for folk songs and pop songs. So that's a reason that I haven't been very successful in expressing myself in Arabic, which is my mother tongue. And that plays a huge role in kind of this general idea of loss that runs through the things that I write.
So to just maybe go a bit deeper into the question of languages. So you are multilingual, but the poems are not. So they are not even bilingual or translingual. So you decide to write in English or in German, and so this is something at this point in the history of poetry, something very specific, because there is a tendency to go translingual for people who are who live in more than one language. But you decided to, most of the time, keep them kind of intact, and so this is something where there's not loss in the language of one poem. Or sometimes there are little things like, I want to talk about this more later, but just to give an example, you write some poem in German and you use the word Körper, and then you translate it to English and it's body, and when you read the German with this English, you think, well, the German word shouldn't be body, shouldn't be Körper, but it should be Körperschaft. And so there is something that in the German word Körper, it contains the English meaning in the German poem. And there are several instances that work like that. So, but generally you put them separately. So why is that?
It has a lot to do with the way I think. In my own head, actually, I kind of have. So I speak 3 languages, and each of them has its own different register, and to a certain extent, its own different character or personality that hides behind it. And so it also has a lot to do, therefore it has a lot to do with certain knowledge bases that I managed to develop that don't necessarily translate into one another. It's about conceptual spaces, it's about even finding the vocabulary to express certain things and certain ideas. But for instance, the reason I keep German and English specifically very separate, first is because I think as an outsider and as an Ausländer in Germany, there's a lot kind of riding on the fact that someone speaks in German the way Germans would prefer to speak it. So I would say I'm not afforded the same kind of luxury in mixing the languages as much as possible, because they've always connoted something else. They've always pointed a direct arrow as to my being an Ausländer, as to my being a foreigner, as to my being someone who came here and is trying to kind of pick up the language. English I find more fluid, actually. And in a lot of my earlier drafts, I would actually try to incorporate a little bit of Arabic. But I found that using words, bringing words from Arabic into English, kind of raw, without any transformation, alienated a lot of people, because again, it kind of pointed to the rest and not to the message. People would often get too hung up on what is this word, I don't know this word, and it kind of puts them off. And with poetry, you already have this problem that not a lot of people kind of find it easy to engage with the texts, just because the form itself is kind of a little intimidating for some people, and I'm not sure why. I think you can read into it whatever you want and not get hung up on a word. But the way I managed to kind of make it translingual for me is that I picked up a lot of the small things that are specific to my dialect, certain expressions and certain senses, certain archaicness that comes with the dialect and with Arabic, classical Arabic as well. And I tried to kind of match them or put them in a different vessel that can actually better communicate the sense of what I feel and what I want to show the world, as opposed to kind of having a deal with it attitude. So I would say it's probably about accessibility for the reader and kind of knowing my audience, but it's also about kind of actually wanting to be heard, having been marginalized for a large part of my life. I didn't have access to people, I didn't have access to an audience, and I didn't have access to a community for a very long time, except in very kind of sporadic instances. So it's a question of understanding. I want to build a bridge as opposed to only make a statement. Yeah.
So I think that's a good point to give you back the voice and hear some more poems.
Thank you. This next poem is called Ein Wunsch. Hättest du die Zeit gehabt, hätte ich dir beschrieben, was alles passiert, wenn die Geschichten dreier Welten in einem einzigen Kopf zusammenkommen und dort miteinander kämpfen. Ich hätte dir ein Gespenst gezeigt, das nach 22 Jahren Haft immer noch die Wände seiner Zelle entlang geistert. Du hast aber keine. A wish. Had you had the time, I would have described to you everything that happens when the histories of three worlds come together in one single head and fight there with another. I would have shown you a wraith that, after 22 years of imprisonment, still haunts the walls of its cell. But you have none. And speaking to the theme of tonight and also to the festivals being had, Archäologie des Verlust, Archaeology of Loss, this next poem is about a trinket that I've held with me ever since I left Damascus, and it's actually the broken keys to my old apartment. Memory. Wet with waves and withered, saline and brittle, I keep the keys to a prison no longer there. Rust-ridden, their jingles recall the rattles of rain. Their ridges resemble ruin in brown silhouettes. Time tries and teases their tottering state, my trinket mates. Translated into German by Sylvia Geist. Erinnerung. Wellen durchnässt und verdorrt, salzig und morsch. Ich halte die Schlüssel zu einem Gefängnis fest, das es nicht mehr gibt. Verrostet klimpern sie wie prasselnder Regen. Ihrer braunen Kanten ähneln Ruinen. Zeit prüft und verschaukelt ihren Taumelzustand, meinen anhänglichen Tand. I speak a lot about being isolated and being in exile as well. And this next poem speaks a little bit to that. Death. I died first, before I was 2. My mother drugged me, fearing for herself. By 5, I had fallen for death. It caught me once, through the wall, and shook me dead. At 8, I prayed to be a cherub, a sinless martyr, chirping and cheering for the coming peace. When I was 12, I tumbled down Mount Mezze. At the foot of one of its mounds, dirtied with the dust of its towering height, I died. A year after, I rolled under the hind wheels of my rustling school bus. After my right ear, my skull was crushed, and its contents covered the street in a passing atrocity. My funeral marched through a field of lazy, overgrown weeds. I died a few times more, but I lived the lives I lived before. Translated in German by Sylvia Geist. Sterben. Ich starb zum ersten Mal, da war ich keine 2. Meine Mutter vergiftete mich aus Angst um sich selbst. Mit 5 hätte ich mich schon ins Sterben verliebt. Einmal erwischte es mich durch die Wand hindurch und schüttelte mich tot. Mit 8 betete ich darum, ein Engelchen zu sein. Ein sündeloser Märtyrer, jauchzte und jubelte ich dem nahenden Frieden zu. Als ich 12 war, stürzte ich vom Mount Mersey. Am Fuße eines seiner Ausläufer, beschmutzt vom Staub seiner himmelhohen Gipfel, starb ich. Ein Jahr danach rollte ich dem rostig raschelnden Schulbus unter die Hinterräder. Nach meinem rechten Ohr wurde mein Schädel zerquetscht und sein Inhalt überzog die Straße mit einem vorübergehenden Grauen. Mein Leichenzug marschierte durch ein Feld träger wuchernder Gräser. Ich starb noch ein paar Mal, aber vorher lebte ich die Leben, die ich lebte. This question about language seems to always come up, and this poem is about that. Ein lebendiger Traum. Auf einer Bühne verweiblicht meine Zunge das Maskulinum und neutert es. Auf einer Bühne wird die Bedeutung mein Nachwuchs. Ich erschaffe sie dreifach, um sie zu bemuttern. Ich hebe sie aus dem Nichts, um sie zu vergöttern. Ohnmächtig wach ich auf mit einer an die Stirn gehefteten Akte, die ausweist, was ich wirklich bin, die Entfremdung verkörpert. A living dream. My tongue feminizes the masculine and neuters it on a stage. On a stage, meaning becomes my offspring. I make it threefold to mother it. I raise it from nothingness to deify it. Powerless, I awake with a form stapled to my head, and it outs me as who I really am. Alienation in a body.
Yeah, thanks again. So there are some themes that reoccur in your poems. So one question is about God and what is the role of God in your poems. You just use the word deify, which is quite big. And yeah, so there are several appearances of God and godlike instances, ideas. So what about that?
Apart from growing up in a religious culture, and kind of, again, this goes back to the question of language, my only access to, or some of my access to classical Arabic was through the Quran, which is the holy speech. And in that I started to kind of realize that the speech or a speech act is an act of creation. And in that sense, when someone begins to speak in a language and starts to make a statement or starts to create an image or starts to write a poem or anything like that, where it's a willful expression, where the words aren't just kind of sliding out of one's mouth, that in a sense is a godlike act. Because this goes back to kind of also the Bible, in a sense that, you know, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word is God. And while I'm not a believer, these verses kind of hold true to me, and they kind of ring a bell for me. And so in that sense, it's taking the reign of creation and finding a world and creating a world into one's own hands, because the ones that are available are too overridden with the beliefs of others and the hopes of others, and so on and so forth. So it's a kind of pulling the world back into a personal space and trying to find somewhere that says, I am here and I can do things as well, I can create.
That's very interesting. So I've never thought about this aspect of it, but there are several theories or poets who say there's a closeness between prayer and poem, and so the art of talking in a prayer and in a poem are very related, and maybe the one derived from the other, or they are somehow close. But to say that a poem and writing and speaking is like a godish act of creation, this is another kind of thought, yeah.
I realize it might sound a little conceited actually, but when you come from having no abilities to do anything, when you have zero control over your life for a very long time, when it is all kind of handed to you and regulated for you from the outside, be it from a dictator, be it from a parent, be it from an authority, be it from any thing that kind of says you have to do this and this, and these are the things available to you, then you start to kind of identify with any power of creation. And it's not to kind of look down on another person, but it's actually to create space for oneself and to kind of derive a little sense of, you know, there is room for me. Yeah. And speaking of the prayer, yes, I do think so, even though that's not where I approach poetry from, but to me, I think a poem is a lot like a spell, in the sense that you can actually do things to another person with simple words if they are delivered properly, or if they actually touch a nerve, or if they kind of speak to an experience that another person has had. So to me, a poem is not just something that I kind of write down on a page and forget about. For me, it's actually an active relationship between two people. So in a lot of sense, when I'm writing, I'm always thinking of an audience, and I'm trying to think, what kind of emotions will this give in a person? What kind of effect do I want? How do I want to, if someone were to recite these poems, how do I want their mouth to move? How do I want their breath to kind of be exhaled? How do I want these things? So in a sense, it gives you this kind of power when you have none other.
Yeah, that's something I also found, especially in these little differences I talked about earlier. For example, the one poem you just read about the haunted cell. In the English translation you did yourself, you used the word wraith, which is something much darker than just Gespenst. And you could have used a lot of words, but you chose wraith. And so, and the mythology it comes from and what it stands for is very special. And even in the German version, I not even thought that the cell would be the cell of the ghost, because the his, I just thought it would be like a person, and so it's haunted, but not that it's the cell of the breath itself, and it's like haunting itself, and something from something, yeah, like an occult magic, like you said, in a way, and that spell casting, and so it's not only it's deeper in mythology, but also in pop culture, and so what is this? What is this wrath about?
I actually like that you're reading into it that much. It actually comes, for me, from a cliche where someone has suffered so much that they say they've been hollowed out, and what is left of them is, you know, a trace or a shell of a person. But a shell to me is not something that's animated. It's not something that can still express anything, whereas a wraith specifically is a ghost with some kind of will. And the haunting, to kind of haunt the cell in itself, it is the cell of a person, but this person has been under so much pressure, so to speak, that they've lost the ability to kind of feel their own physicality. And yet, even though they've lost this sense of physicality, they cannot escape an imprisonment, a sense of imprisonment. So it kind of toys with this idea that some prisons are actually inescapable. Some prisons remain in one's head. And this speaks to a lot of trauma, for instance, when someone has been very recurrently traumatized and for a very long time, then it gets very difficult to kind of not relive or revisit those experiences over and over again. And in that sense, it feels very real, even in a corporeal manner, but because it is something to do with the psyche and with even a moving kind of fluid psyche that knows no real time in a flashback, it felt very adequate for me that a wraith is kind of the better translation there. And naturally, I don't have the same reach of vocabulary in German, so I tried to kind of add that layer in the English, especially since I knew they were going to be side by side.
Yeah, for me, just reading the German first, with Gespenst, if you would have gone for Spectre, it would have been Karl Marx and the whole different political meaning also in it. But you chose to go for a different kind of depth. Another thing, you read in your first reading, you read the poem about the child, and now the one about the stage and the feminizing. So I was wondering, in the German, you kind of stick to pronouns in a way that you don't in the English. And when you translate, you use them and their, what would be kind of natural for English now, but the German doesn't have these possibilities so much. Or you would have to put another kind of effort in it. And I was wondering why you don't do that. So especially in the child poem, it would be obvious to seek a different kind of gender pronouns and not just stick with the child, and then it's and a neutral one, which even in German it's fucked up. I don't like to use it. Das Kind das, or das Mädchen das. It's bullshit. So what about this problem?
So this goes back to the idea of conceptual space that I have and all the different knowledge bases. So as you said, in English, for me, I think there is this conceptual space now that it's actually known that You can be non-binary and things don't have to be as gendered. But in Arabic and in German, you kind of have to gender everything. And as to why I didn't do it in German is because I still don't feel like it's my place. It's not a language that is yet fully mine, that I can kind of change around in any way that I want. And that also goes back to kind of, I don't want to alienate myself from it, but at the same time, I also don't want to, so to speak, overstep a boundary that is, you know, it's not a real boundary, so to speak, but if I want the idea or if I want the kind of the emotion to reach a more, you know, kind of, let's say, mainstream audience, it's, in German specifically, it's not yet my fight to fight. That would be the case if it were in Arabic, for instance, then I would have taken a lot more liberties in kind of toying with the language in a way that might actually give a different perspective or something like that, but not in German, unfortunately. It's a language that I use for a certain goal. It's for a certain Zweck. It's a Zwecksprache. Be it Verwaltung, be it therapy, be it kind of communicating with someone on the street. But it is not yet a language that I can fully kind of put myself into or, so to speak, take as many risks in.
Some more poems, maybe?
Speaking about this idea of not being entitled to the language, Mundkot. Vom Körper der Menschenrechtsgeschichte bin ich ausgenommen, denn ich bin kein Mensch. Ich bin seine Ausscheidung, wenn er kränkelt und nicht sieht, was ihn kränkt. Das bedingt meine Fremdheit und meine Braunheit, insofern ich beides nicht wegwaschen kann. Weil ich diesen Zustand bewohnen muss, verstecke ich mich in seiner Zunge und benetze mich mit wohlklingenden Worten, bis ich entweder gehört oder wieder ausgeschieden werde. Ich bin der Kot des Leviathan. Wenn ich austrete, werde ich sofort wieder aufgefressen. So kreist mein Leben. Mouth shit. I'm excluded from the body of human rights, for I am no human. I am its excretion when it is ill and cannot see what ails it. This forms my foreignness and my brownness, insofar I cannot wash either away. Because I must make home this state, I hide and wet myself in its tongue, with euphonious words until I am either heard or excreted again. I am the Leviathan's feces. When I am evacuated, I get eaten up right after. Such is the cycle of my life. And back to the idea of this kind of creation and the spell-likenness of a poem or a speech act. Gleichnis. Ein Gedicht ist wie ein Leben, eine Unwahrscheinlichkeit, die sich in etwas gekleidet hat. Beide blieben nicht von der Sünde des Ausdruckswillens verschont. Nicht einmal das Nichts selbst. Auch das würde aus seinem Unsein herausgezogen und zu etwas aus geätzter Luft gemacht. Am Anfang kleidete sich das Bewusstsein in einen Drang. Der Drang kleidete sich in eine Stimme. Die Stimme ging nackt und verlor sich in der Lautheit, bis die Zeit sie fand und in winziger Stückchen schnitt. Sie kleidete jedes von ihnen in sein Gegenteil und erschuf so Bedeutung nach der Art seiner Vorfahren. Simile. A poem is like a life, an improbability that clothed itself in something. Both were not spared the sin of the will to express, not even nothingness itself. It, too, was dragged from its unbeing and made into a thing out of etched air. In the beginning, consciousness clothed itself in an urge. The urge clothed itself in a voice. The voice went naked and lost itself in loudness until time found it and cut it into minute bits. It clothed each of them in its opposite and created thus meaning after the kind of its forebears. And to the idea of the audience and thinking of them always. Who shall I address? Do you have the time? Are you at ease of mind? Do you have shoulders big as boulders to carry the binds crooking my spine? Do you have an eye for or to lend the form? Perhaps an ear to hear it flow. I sow your every no with these virulent words and verbose verse. I know. From English by Sylvia Geist. Wen soll ich ansprechen? Haben Sie die Zeit? Die innere Ausgeglichenheit? Haben Sie den stierstarken Nacken? Würden Sie mein Leben packen? Könnten Sie sich bequemen, es auf Ihren Buckel zu nehmen? Haben Sie eine Perspektive oder leihen mir Ihre Papiere? Ein Ohr, um etwas mitzukriegen, sollte es doch einmal passieren. Ich sehe jedes Ihrer Neins mit diesen bissigen, übermäßig flüssigen Zeilen. Ich weiß.
Yeah, that's a great example for form. So we wanted to talk about form a little bit. You have very kind of old schoolish types of poems, like two verse, or this one that's more like almost like a nursery rhyme or something. And you even have prose, and you have very contemporary sounding or more play-like poems. So what about form?
I suck at long form. But yeah, poetry to me, again, is a lot like a spell. And this conciseness, this having to select every single word to a certain effect kind of comes very much into play. Poetry is kind of in the middle between having absolute freedom and having very strict rules. So in that sense, I find it the very easiest way to kind of put the things that I have to say into words. But it also comes, I first started by writing songs for my band. And in that regard, it was also English, as I mentioned. It was to reach the widest audience as possible. But then, being musically impaired and not being able to do music anymore, I tried to practice as much as possible to make my own music. And sometimes I found that words can have a very good musical quality in and of their own. So to me, that's kind of what it comes down to. It's wanting to do music and not being able to fully, having a lot to say but not knowing how to say it. So the compactness really helps there. And as for the oldness, this goes back to the idea of not knowing so much time. I don't live my life unfortunately, in my memory, things didn't happen one thing after the next after the next. It's kind of again, a patchwork of memories and blinks here and there. Something happened and it doesn't necessarily follow or correlate to the next thing. And it comes with having to live in 3 languages and kind of always being in between languages and having to translate myself always. So to me, I kind of treat literature in the same manner. I don't think there is time in literature, or at least for the longest time, I didn't think there is time, paradoxical as that may sound. So when I wanted to express, I tried to not kind of stick to what is the most contemporary, what is the most hip, or what is the most kind of readable. I let the idea kind of decide for that. Some ideas lend themselves a lot better to a more elevated form, things that are perhaps more spiritual, that have a little bit more substance. There are a few things that are a little too personal that I can't even make musical, much as I've tried, but I mean, for all heaven's sake, they just want to come out, so they need to be written down in some form. And then there are some things that I actually feel that I have the freedom to play around with, and so that's kind of where that comes from.
But also, our poetry is or in the history of poetry, it's very much connected to memory and to memorize. Especially the rhymes, and so yeah. So the memory is in, or you kind of create the memory in writing poetry. And how did you stick to poetry all these years? And it cannot have been easy to. Just to stick to poetry of all things?
I don't know. In that regard, I think I'm weird because it always came a lot easier to me than writing in any kind of long format. Even short stories I struggle with, because with prose you kind of need that linearity of events. You kind of need...
I don't think so.
And yeah, my writing classes lied to me.
Definitely.
I mean, of course, you can have freedom there, but it's also kind of very tiring having to put so many words to paper. The sheer volume of words to create a narrative is very tiring. And a lot of these poems were actually written in a time where I couldn't afford the fatigue of putting so much to paper. So in that sense, poetry just kind of pours out, and sometimes I can just follow the sound, sometimes I can follow the meaning, sometimes I can follow the feeling. So in that regard, it didn't restrict me as much. I'm not one to keep a diary, but in my poems I put a lot of pieces of myself, and in that sense they kind of become like little trinkets that I can carry around. They're light, and but still they can open a lot of doors. So you can say they're kind of a mental shorthand.
Let's get a bit more into that, the relationship between yourself and your poems. In a recent interview you gave, you used the verb accommodate, and I like that very much. And you have talked about the audience, and I think so. Many of the poems use a lyric I, and this can accommodate a lot and manifold. And what do you think is the relationship between the I and the poem and you, and autofictionality, but also, yeah, the fiction and the faction in poetry?
It's a bit of a weird relationship because while I do want to be seen, I don't want to be exposed. So I would say it's a kind of maybe a kind of seduction or enticement into one's story, that you give in enough details of yourself that are actually true so that they elicit a response, but at the same time you leave enough space in the poem so that someone can fill in and kind of be able to step into your shoes. And I think that if it were, let's say, 100% autobiographical or 100% self-contained, or if it didn't take any heed of the audience, then that wouldn't be very possible. That wouldn't, no one would be able to step in and go like, yes, I also identify with this. Yes, I also feel like an outsider, and I can kind of fit the things that don't fit elsewhere into these poems. So in a sense, it's kind of like presenting you with a bit of a puzzle, but leaving out certain blocks of it that if you have them, then you can put them in there, and they're not necessarily any shape or form. You can kind of weave that in. So that's kind of my relationship with the lyrical I. It's not necessarily that I'm using a fundamentally different perspective, but it's kind of like performing behind a certain veil that allows me to perhaps show my movements and still be able to express and be heard without at the same time exposing myself too much that I become too vulnerable to the world. Because a lot of this poetry comes from a very vulnerable place, and it was written in actually very vulnerable moments. But it was always, in a sense, kind of self-reassuring that it is actually okay to speak and to express and to also be heard. But then, to me, that in itself doesn't make a poem. A poem, again, is a relationship for me between two people, between the text and the reader. It's not even between myself and the reader. It's between the text that I end up putting on a paper and the reader. And I want that relationship to actually be good. I want to leave enough space for the other person to kind of step in and give of themselves as much as I have given, or as much as the text gives them. Yeah, so that's that, I think.
Yeah, I have a lot of more questions, but I think you should read more.
I want. A late morning lay. 3 spoonfuls of sugar in my coffee, to sense scorching sunlight on my skin, get undone by mid-August breezes. I want it to hurt in my eyes and my flesh. I'm fond of all pain. Darkness tends the soul. I want the carnal. I want a cold caress. May it rest against my chest, then run into and through this lunatic hair I leave loose. I want comfort in the breast and arm and all the small smiles that warm the heart. I want hope from elsewhere than the bottom of a glass that shows only my unface. 3 spoonfuls of sugar in the coffee, plain please, and to take. Ich will, from the English by Ulf Stolterfurt. Einen Fick am späten Morgen. 3 Löffel Zucker in den Kaffee. Das Stechen der Sonne spüren auf meiner Haut und wie sie sich abkühlt durch einen Lufthauch Mitte August. Ich will, dass es weh tut, in den Augen und im Fleisch. Ich bin gut Freund mit allen Schmerzen. Dunkelheit tut die Seele gut. Ich will Sinnlichkeit. Ich will eine kalte Umarmung. Möge sie an meiner Brust verweilen, dann übergehen in ein Streicheln dieses wirren Haares, das ich offen trage. Ich will Trost in Brust und Armen und das kleine Lächeln, das dir das Herz wärmt. Ich will Hoffnung, die nicht am Boden eines Glases liegt und mir allein mein Nichtgesicht zeigt. 3 Löffel Zucker in den Kaffee bitte, sonst nichts und zum Mitnehmen. Going back to the flatness of time, this is aphorism of the day. The day is today, mine and your day, the due day and only true due date, this day. From the English by Monika Rink, Aphorismus des Tages. Heute ist der Tag, mein Tag und dein Tag, der Tattag und einziger wahrer Fähigkeitstag, dieser Tag.
Maybe let's talk, so this conversation tends to come to an end, but maybe let's also talk a little bit about the project Weiterschreiben, which was very improbable to begin with, thanks to Annika, who is here tonight, Annika Reich. And its reach was also kind of maybe accommodate poets who came to Germany just to give them opportunities to write on and to connect with writers from Germany or German language writers, and to maybe find a place somewhere in the community. And so that you're here today and have a book, this is one of the most improbable outcomings of the whole story. And so how was your way through Weiterschreiben and to find your translators and to work with them, and then your publisher and all of that?
it all starts when I was a second-year politics student at Bard College Berlin, and we wanted to promote the scholarship program that I was receiving. And instead of doing something conventional, I kind of came up with a suggestion to one of my professors, Marion Detjen, that, you know, a lot of us who are receiving the scholarship can actually do a few creative things. And so perhaps it would be a good way to kind of also produce something in the process. So I tried my hand in writing poetry in German. It wasn't very good, but she really enjoyed it. And it kind of went from there. Then I ended up at the Volksbühne the first time. And in the audience was Annika Reich. And I think she really enjoyed the reading as well, and that opened a very wide door for me. So I ended up publishing Patchwork with Weiterschreiben. And since then, and also the text, the prose text at the very beginning of the book, Die Armen in den Städten, which I wrote for the Weiterschreiben magazine edition, Salzt uns, which actually took a very different approach on biographies by trying to introduce the authors through their relationship with food and the things that they carry with them. You know, the consistencies that they like and the things and the so it's a very sense-oriented kind of edition, and between those two things, I realized that this is a project that is throwing a lot of passion into the careers of the authors that they sign. And they're actually willing to kind of go above and beyond for, again, accommodating the different needs of these poets. And that happens mostly through a tandem program where each author is signed up with or hitched with a German author, and they exchange notes on the different scenes, on the different methods, on everything like that, and whatever arises from that communication ends up being published on the website. My tandem is Ulf Stolterfoth, by the way, who actually translated large portions of the book. And from there, I was lucky enough to sign to Elisabeth Ruger Agentur, who then who represented me in the best way and tried to push this book as much as possible. And eventually, it landed with Hanser Berlin, and I couldn't be happier about that. So it all took a very kind of gradual step, but Weiterschreiben had supported me for the kind of the longest time, because between then and now, I had to really establish some kind of milestones and certain stepping stones until I could actually sit here and have this event with you. And it couldn't have happened without Weiterschreiben or the larger Wir machen das network. Yeah, so I actually owe them a lot, and I'm very thankful.
So, yeah, maybe I will stop here and we will continue the conversation with all of you after a poem. So,
the last poem for today is actually the poem from which the title of this book comes from. It's called Soliloquy. I am not. Another rules me. Whatever. They want me. To be, I shall. Whatever they want me to be, I shall. The stone of their eye sets my image. The lash of their tongue tries my words. The curse of their forebears tells my acts. The end of their rule bodes my decay. You are not, I rule you. Selbstgespräch. From the English by Sylvia Geist. Ich bin nicht. Man bestimmt über mich. Was immer man will, dass ich sei, ich werde es. Manns steinernes Auge erstarrt mein Bild. Manns Zungenschlag peitscht meine Worte ein. Manns vorväterlicher Fluch diktiert meine Handlung. Das Ende seiner Bestimmungen verspricht meinen Fall. Du bist nicht. Ich bestimme dich. Thank you.
Ja, wir haben hier ein Mikrofon, mit dem ich gerne rumgehe für Anmerkungen, Fragen, was auch immer Ihnen und euch in den Sinn und aus dem Herzen kommt.
Hi Sam, so nice to hear all of these wonderful poems from you and everything that has been said about you. My question is very technical and I am very curious to hear about your writing process. And you mentioned that you don't keep a diary and you only write in the form of poems and songs. How is your writing process and how has that changed throughout the years and the languages and the settings you've been in? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I don't have a writing process. I wish I had. It would have made things so much easier. The only way I can describe whatever process I might have is actually, it's kind of this will sound pretentious, but it's a bit of an outpour, a lot of things at the same time, and then later kind of looking back at these texts with a fresh set of eyes and editing them to make them more suitable for an audience. This has always been the case. I used to try and write in very strict forms, but that always felt a little too forced for me. So instead I tried to kind of internalize the way that I like a poem to sound and the way that you can hide as many kind of Easter eggs here and there in the text, and as many kind of little palimpsests that kind of developed layers the more you read them and when other and different people read them. So yeah, it kind of became something a little more holistic in a sense than having to overthink. But yeah, it usually comes in this kind of pattern. I would say it's not necessarily a process, it's more of a pattern that something keeps going around in my head. It's a certain sound or a certain sentence, and I just have to write it down, so I do. And I see where it takes me. Like I said, sometimes I follow the sound, sometimes I follow the feeling, sometimes the image kind of presents itself to me and I have to describe it. But I always leave things aside for quite a while and then look back on them with a fresh set of eyes in order to see what works and what doesn't, what kind of serves the poem and what doesn't, and how much space is this poem leaving for a reader. Yeah.
Hi, Sam.
Hi.
I'm wondering, so yeah, from Bard, I remember that you had certain interests in certain literatures and very like intensive, what in German we call Lektüren. I wouldn't even know whether one says lectures. No, in English, but this Lektüren experience. Could you talk a little bit about that, whether there are Lektüren that actually influenced the poems more than others, or traditions, or other poets from the past?
I mean, I like to say that no text comes from a vacuum, so it always has influences. And even though I've tried as much as possible to kind of, so I had a very antagonistic relationship with books while I was growing up. And then when I started reading, I couldn't have enough for a while. So in terms of English poetry, I was always more oriented towards the Romantics, but then kind of finding that that is a bit of a dead school with a lot of not the best implications for today, kind of made me search for other schools. And so I orient myself now a lot more towards the kind of the more modern pathological kind of writing, in the likes of, if I can concretize it, Sylvia Plath, for instance, played a huge role in the kinds of sounds that I wanted to play with for English. And then Edgar Allan Poe for all the melancholy. And then for German, it was actually the two biggest influences, I would have to say, are Erich Fried. His political poem, I know that nowadays, I've heard that nowadays he's actually more associated with his love poems, that you read at a wedding or something like that, but I actually found I found a gold mine of poetry in his political writings. There's something so earnest there, and that's a quality that I appreciate the most in poetry. It's when it's earnest, it's not overworked. And in Erich Fried's political poem, writing right after World War II, coming fresh from really huge traumas that I could identify with, that played a huge role. And then to kind of embellish all of that, I got into sound poems, and the biggest for me there would be Ernst Jandl. All right, thank you. Thank you, Daniela.
To this first book and all the books to come.